He shouldn't have touched him like that, especially not after what everyone said he'd lost. Malachi Reeves pressed his back against the cold hallway wall, staring at the door in front of him. Room 412. Top floor of a building that smelled like old money and quiet threats. The job listing had said private tutoring. High pay. No questions. He'd told himself it was fine. He needed rent. He needed groceries. He needed to stop drowning. He knocked anyway. The door opened before his knuckles finished the second tap. The man standing there wasn't what Malachi expected. Xavier Doss, 6'3", dark skin like polished mahogany, tattoos climbing his neck and disappearing into the collar of a black shirt that hung slightly open. One arm resting on the door frame, the other held loose at his side, fingers wrapped in a fresh bandage that hadn't been changed recently enough. His jaw was tight. His eyes were quieter than they should have been. Not angry, not threatening, just watching. Malachi felt the stare like a hand pressing flat against his chest. "You're late," Xavier said. His voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. 3 minutes, Malachi answered. He didn't know why he said it, but he didn't take it back. Something moved in Xavier's expression. Not irritation, closer to surprise, like he hadn't expected pushback, like he'd forgotten what it felt like. He stepped aside without another word. Malachi walked in. The room was wrong for what it was. It wasn't a dorm room. It was a study that had been converted to look like one. Shelves of documents. A long mahogany desk cleared at one end. Candles already burning in a bronze holder near the window, even though the lights worked fine. A glass of whiskey sitting untouched by the chair. The kind of room that told you the person inside it had stopped pretending they were somewhere safe. "Sit," Xavier said. Malachi sat across from the desk. Xavier lowered himself into the chair on the opposite side slowly, deliberately, like every movement required a small, internal decision. Malachi caught it. He wasn't supposed to. He looked away. The documents were complex. Financial structures layered inside legal language, some of it in a second language Malachi recognized from his international finance elective. Xavier pointed at a section near the bottom of the first page. "Read this to me." Malachi looked up. "You can't read it yourself?" The silence that followed was thick enough to sit on. "I asked you to read it," Xavier said again. Same tone. No heat added. Malachi picked up the document. He started reading. Halfway through the second paragraph, Xavier leaned forward. Slowly. His forearm came to rest on the table, and his body angled toward Malachi's side like the words needed to be heard from a shorter distance. His shoulder nearly touched Malachi's. The warmth of him was immediate and unasked for. Malachi kept reading. But his voice slipped on one word. Just once. Xavier didn't comment on it. That was somehow worse. Hi viewers, have you ever taken a job you knew felt off, but stayed anyway because you needed the money too badly to walk away? By the time Malachi finished the third document, the candle near the window had burned down by half an inch. Xavier hadn't moved away. If anything, he'd settled closer. Not aggressively. Not even consciously, it seemed. More like gravity. Like Malachi's presence was a fixed point he kept drifting toward without realizing it. The last document had a handwritten annotation in the margin. Small letters. Tight. A different pen than the rest. Malachi almost mentioned it. Then Xavier reached across, not for the paper. His hand came to rest on the page just beside Malachi's fingers. Not touching. Just there. Malachi went still. Xavier's voice dropped. That section. Read it again. Malachi read it again. His own heartbeat was embarrassingly loud in his ears. He didn't understand why. Nothing had happened. Nothing had been said. No line had been crossed that he could point to and name. It was just a man who needed documents read aloud. That was all this was. That was all. When they finished, Xavier stood and walked to the window. He didn't say goodbye. Didn't thank him. Just stood there with his back turned like Malachi had already left. Malachi gathered his bag. At the door he paused. He didn't know why. He turned back just once. Xavier was still at the window, one hand braced on the frame. The candlelight hit the bandage on his other arm. His shoulders were heavy in a way that had nothing to do with posture. Malachi left. In the elevator, he stared at his own reflection in the metal doors. He'd read documents for a man who said nothing, moved too close, and never once raised his voice. And somehow, that was the most unsettling 2 hours of his life. If Xavier Doss had truly lost what everyone said he had, then why did Malachi's hands still feel warm where they'd almost touched his? The money hit Malachi's account at exactly midnight. He stared at the number, stared at it again. That wasn't a tutoring rate. That was a number someone left when they wanted you to come back without being asked. He came back. He told himself it was the money. He told himself a lot of things that week. The second session started the same way. Xavier already seated when Malachi arrived. Documents already out. Whiskey untouched again. Candles already burning. Like none of it had ever stopped. Like Malachi had simply stepped out for a moment and the room had waited. The routine set itself fast. Too fast for something that hadn't been agreed to. Xavier would place a document. Malachi would read. Xavier would lean in, always just close enough for it to mean nothing, never far enough for it to feel comfortable. Between pages, silence. Not awkward silence. The kind that had weight. The kind that pressed. On the third night, Malachi arrived to find a second chair had been moved. It was now directly beside Xavier's instead of across from him. Malachi looked at it. Xavier looked at the documents. "Sit," he said. Same word. Same tone. Malachi sat in the new chair. Their shoulders were now 6 inches apart. The desk surface between them vanished. They were reading the same page from the same angle. The scent of Xavier's cologne settled over the space between them like it belonged there. Malachi stared at the words on the page and read them perfectly and understood nothing. On the fourth night, Darius showed up. He came in without knocking. A tall man, lean and sharp-faced, with the kind of eyes that calculated everything they landed on. He worked for Xavier. That much was clear in the way he moved through the space, like he had permission, but only as much as he'd been given. He looked at Malachi, then at the chairs. Something shifted in his expression. Quick, gone before it fully arrived. "I need to borrow him," Darius said, meaning Xavier. Xavier didn't look up from the page. "You don't." Darius lingered another 3 seconds. Then he left. Malachi watched the door close. "Who was that?" he asked. "Someone who asks questions he already knows the answers to," Xavier said. Malachi filed that away. Later, in the hallway after the session ended, Darius was waiting. He didn't move aggressively, didn't block the path, just stood there with his hands in his pockets like he'd accidentally ended up in that particular spot at that particular time. "You're doing good work," he said. Malachi nodded once, started walking. "You shouldn't be alone with him," Darius said quietly. "Not right now. Not like this." Malachi stopped. He turned slowly. Darius wasn't looking at him like a threat. He was looking at him like a warning. The kind someone delivers because they've already seen how the story ends. "He's my client," Malachi said. Darius nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable thing to say. Like it was also completely beside the point. He walked away first. Malachi stood in the hallway for a moment too long. The floor was quiet. The building was quiet. Somewhere behind room 412, a candle was still burning. He thought about Xavier's posture at the window the first night. The heaviness in it. The way the whole room seemed to bend around him without him doing anything at all. The way Darius looked at him, not like a man who'd lost power. Like a man everyone was still being careful around. Like something that had gone quiet. Not gone. Just quiet. Malachi pushed the elevator button. If Xavier was truly powerless like the rumors said, then why did every single person in that building still move like he might change his mind at any second? It started with a hand. Not in a way that made sense to explain later. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be pointed to as a moment. Xavier reached across during a reading session to turn the page, and his hand landed over Malachi's instead of beside it. 1 second. Maybe 2. Xavier pulled back without acknowledging it. Malachi kept reading, but the temperature in the room had shifted. He felt it in the back of his neck, in the way his next breath came in slightly too fast. The sessions had developed their own rhythm by then, a shape neither of them had agreed to but both of them kept. Malachi arrived. Xavier was already there. Documents came out. Their chairs were close. Shoulders were within reach. And somewhere between the second and third document of any given night, Xavier would create a reason to be closer. He didn't dominate the space. That was the thing Malachi kept turning over in his mind. A man like Xavier Doss, even injured, even quieter than his reputation, should have filled a room the way a lit match fills a dark space. Fast. Unavoidable. Everything reorienting toward it. But he didn't do that with Malachi. He just moved toward him. Quietly. Precisely. Like Malachi was a fixed point and everything else was just the room. By the second week, the hand contact wasn't accidental. Xavier would guide the page with 2 fingers and let them brush Malachi's wrist on the way. He would lean over to point at a line and his jaw would pass close enough to Malachi's temple that Malachi could feel warmth where they hadn't touched. "Here," Xavier would say, and his voice at that range was different. Quieter. Lower. Not softer exactly. More like something being handled carefully. One night, Malachi looked up mid-sentence and found Xavier already watching him. Not the document. Him. Malachi finished the sentence. Xavier didn't look away. "You skipped a line," he said. Malachi looked back at the page. He hadn't skipped anything. He knew that. Xavier knew that. Neither of them addressed it. On the 9th day, Malachi noticed something. Xavier had other staff. A housekeeper who came in the mornings. A driver who waited in the lobby. Darius, who came and went on a schedule that seemed both random and precise. But none of them sat close. None of them stayed longer than the task required. Xavier didn't angle his chair toward any of them. Didn't find reasons for his hand to land near theirs. He moved toward Malachi. Only Malachi. That landed different once Malachi let himself see it clearly. This wasn't convenience. This wasn't a man who needed documents read because his eyes were failing. Xavier read his phone fine. Read the labels on folders fine. He needed Malachi in the room. He needed Malachi at that chair. He needed the proximity. Why? Malachi couldn't answer that and sleep well at the same time, so he stopped trying. Then came the night Xavier spoke without a document in front of him. They had finished early. The candles were lower than usual. Malachi was packing his bag. The silence had that stretched quality it sometimes got near the end of sessions, like it was waiting on something. Xavier spoke to the window. "Stay a little longer tonight." Not a question. Barely even a request. Said the way someone says something they've already been sitting with for a while and are only just releasing into the air. Malachi's hand stopped moving inside his bag. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He sat back down. And Xavier didn't turn from the window, but the line of his shoulders, that heaviness Malachi had noticed on the very first night, eased. Slightly, like something had settled. Like that was exactly what he needed. Malachi stared at the side of his face in the candlelight and thought, he didn't ask anyone else. He chose me. And that thought was the most dangerous thing that had crossed his mind since room 412. It was almost midnight when the last candle on the left side of the desk burned low enough to throw the whole room into amber. Malachi had been there 4 hours. That wasn't the job anymore. He knew that. He'd known it for 3 sessions now. But the documents were still on the desk and Xavier was still talking. Not much, never much, but more than before, and Malachi hadn't reached for his bag. They were close. Closer than usual tonight. Their chairs had drifted during the 3rd document, the way they always did. But this time Xavier hadn't reset the distance when they moved to the 4th. The room felt smaller than it was. Xavier was reading silently, his brow drawn slightly, one finger moving across the bottom margin of the page, slowly, like he was counting something Malachi couldn't see. The bandage on his other hand had finally been changed. Fresh white against dark skin. Neat edges. Someone had taken care of it this time. Malachi was watching the candle, telling himself he was watching the candle. Then Xavier leaned back, just slightly, and the movement brought his head down and to the side, and for a half-second, his forehead came to rest against Malachi's temple. Still, not pressing, not asking, just resting. Malachi stopped breathing. It lasted 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Long enough for it to be real. Short enough that later, in a different room, a person could convince themselves it hadn't happened. Then Xavier lifted his head and looked back at the page. This clause here, he said. Same voice. Calm. Read it again. Malachi read it again. His voice was even. He was proud of that. But his thoughts were not even. His thoughts were a problem. Because that hadn't been dominance. That hadn't been power playing out the way Malachi had braced for since day one. That had been something else. Something quieter. The kind of weight a person leans into when they're tired of holding themselves upright alone. Dependence. Not command. Dependence. He found himself, somewhere between the 5th and 6th document, turning a question over that he couldn't put down. Why only him? Xavier had people. He had staff, had Darius, had whoever came and went through that building with careful footsteps and careful eyes. None of them got this. None of them got the close chairs and the warm silences and the forehead pressed quiet against the temple of a man who had no business being in this room this late. Why Malachi? He didn't ask. He knew better than to ask. But the question stayed anyway. It was Darius who gave him the first outside piece. He came in late that night, later than his usual window, and stopped 2 steps inside the door when he saw the setup. The low candles, the chairs, the distance or the lack of it. He looked at Xavier, then at Malachi. His voice was careful when he spoke. The way you'd speak around something you didn't want to startle. I need the Harlan contracts reviewed before morning. Xavier nodded once without looking up. Darius didn't move immediately. He stood there a beat longer than the message required. Then, to no one specific, or maybe to both of them, he said, "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was low, not unkind, almost like he was talking to himself. He doesn't act like that with anyone else. He set the folder on the end of the desk, turned, left. The door clicked shut. Malachi stared at the folder. Xavier hadn't reacted, hadn't tensed, hadn't looked at Darius when he spoke or after he left. He just turned to the next page, like it wasn't news, like it was already settled. Malachi sat with that for a long moment. The candle nearest him dropped another quarter-inch. The room stayed amber. Xavier's hand rested 3 inches from his on the desk, and neither of them moved it. The question he'd been circling finally landed clean and hard in the center of his chest. Why was he the exception? Because the answer mattered now, and Malachi wasn't sure he was ready for it. By the 3rd week, the building had started watching. Malachi noticed it in the elevator. The way the man inside it took 2 steps back when Malachi pressed the button for the 4th floor. Like the floor itself carried a temperature. He noticed it in the lobby. How the front desk staff stopped their side conversations when he walked in. How they tracked him to the elevator with careful, measuring looks. He noticed it in the stairwell one evening when he arrived 10 minutes early and took the stairs instead of waiting. 2 men stood at the landing below the 4th floor. They were talking. Stopped the moment they heard his footsteps. One of them said nothing. The other said 2 words under his breath before they both moved on. He's here. Not Malachi's name. Not a description. Just he's here. Like his arrival at that building had become a known variable. Something accounted for. Watched. That night, the session was quieter than usual. Xavier seemed somewhere else, even while he was present. He turned pages at his normal pace. Sat at the usual distance. But his eyes were moving differently, like they were scanning something Malachi couldn't see. Malachi was halfway through a contract addendum when he heard voices through the wall. Low, male. 2 of them. He kept reading. The voices continued. He caught pieces. Not everything, but enough. Not focused. Hasn't been. A pause. Can't afford that. Not with Harlan watching. Another pause. Longer. He's distracted. Malachi's voice didn't change. He read the next line. And the next. Then one more piece came through the wall, clearer than the rest. He's weak now. Silence from inside the room. Malachi finished the paragraph. Set the page down. He didn't look at Xavier. But Xavier had gone completely still. His hand was flat on the desk. Not tense exactly, but settled. The kind of stillness that wasn't passive, the kind that was chosen. A man deciding exactly how much of himself to show right now. Malachi kept his eyes on the page. He thought about what he knew. He ran it through again quickly, cleanly, without sentiment. Xavier Doss had not been seen publicly in months. The tutoring setup, if anyone could still call it that, had started as a cover. Something low profile while Xavier handled whatever recovery meant for a man who ran 3 territories. But it had become something else. And now it had become visible. Which meant Malachi had become visible. And if the voices on the other side of that wall were saying Xavier was distracted, if they were saying he was weak, then what they were really asking was, what is this person doing here and what does it mean? Malachi was the answer to both questions. He was the distraction. He was the evidence. The thought arrived without drama but landed with full weight. He looked up. Xavier was watching him. Not urgently. Not with anything demanding in it. Just watching. The candlelight caught the edge of his jaw. His bandaged hand was still flat on the desk. He looked like a man waiting to see which direction something falls. Malachi should have started packing his bag. He knew that. Every clean, logical part of him knew that. If he stayed, if this continued, people who wanted Xavier gone would keep building their case. And Malachi would be the evidence they kept pointing to. He was making Xavier look like he had something to lose. And in rooms like this one, having something to lose was the same as handing your enemies a weapon. He should leave. He knew he should leave. His bag was right there. And then Xavier turned back to the next document, smoothed the page with 2 fingers and said quietly, without looking up, "Next section." Like nothing was happening. Like the voices meant nothing. Like Malachi leaving wasn't even a possibility he'd considered. Malachi picked up the page. And that was the problem. Because if he stayed, he might destroy the one thing keeping this man standing. But if he left, he wasn't sure he was going to survive the distance. Now drop a comment. What do you think Malachi should do? Walk away and protect Xavier, or stay and risk becoming the reason everything falls apart? The folder was sitting on the desk when Malachi arrived. Not in the usual stack. Not placed the way Xavier placed things. Deliberate, parallel to the desk edge, corners matched. This one was open. Pages fanned out. Like someone had gone through it in a hurry and left it exactly that way on purpose. Xavier wasn't in the room. Malachi stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he walked in and sat down. He didn't touch the folder. He waited. 7 minutes passed. Then the door behind him opened and Xavier walked in from the connecting room. Jacket off, sleeves rolled, phone in hand. He looked at Malachi, then at the open folder. Something passed across his face, not quite irritation. More like a decision being confirmed. He sat. He pushed the folder toward Malachi without explaining it. Malachi looked down. The pages weren't contracts. They weren't financial structures or legal language. They were communications. Internal ones. Dates going back 9 months. Names Malachi recognized from other documents. Darius, a man called Fenwick, 2 others who appeared frequently under initials only. He started reading. Pause on this, because what was in that folder didn't describe a man who had lost his grip. It described a man who had chosen to put it down. Every major decision in the last 9 months, territory boundaries held, not expanded. Disputes resolved through negotiation. 3 separate situations where the old response would have been force, and the response chosen instead was withdrawal. Not retreat. Withdrawal. Planned. Deliberate. Malachi read the same internal memo twice. Then once more. He didn't lose his power. Darius had written to Fenwick 6 months ago. He stopped using it. There's a difference. The problem is, no one on the outside knows that. And he won't tell them. Malachi set the page down. He looked up at Xavier. Xavier was watching him. Arms folded. Chair slightly back from the desk. Giving Malachi the space to arrive at whatever he was arriving at without being guided there. You chose this, Malachi said. Not a question. Xavier didn't answer immediately. He reached forward and turned one of the pages over. Not hiding it. Just moving it. People see what they need to see, he said finally. Malachi absorbed that. Your own people think you're broken, he said. Some of them, Xavier said. That's useful. Malachi stared at him. The candle near the bookshelf caught a draft from somewhere and bowed hard to the left before straightening. He thought about every session, every document, every night he'd sat in that chair and watched Xavier go quiet at the window and told himself this man was recovering from something. Damaged, contained, working back toward something he'd lost. That whole picture had just changed. Xavier hadn't been recovering. He'd been choosing. Every moment of stillness. Every piece of restraint. Every session where he sat beside Malachi and didn't perform power, none of it was the absence of something. It was a decision made over and over again. Intentional. Which meant everything he'd done with Malachi, every moved chair, every hand near a hand, every stay a little longer, was intentional too. The warmth that thought should have brought landed differently. Because if Xavier had been choosing this whole time, then Malachi had been chosen. Not drifted into, not stumbled upon, chosen. He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't get the chance to figure it out. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He picked it up. One message. For words. We have your brother. Malachi read the message 3 times. His brother Quentin was a grad student. He lived in a shared apartment 6 miles away. He didn't know anything about Xavier Doss. He didn't know anything about this building, these documents, these sessions that had gone on 3 weeks too long. He had nothing to do with any of this. Malachi stood up. His chair scraped back loud against the floor. Xavier was on his feet before Malachi fully stood, already watching, already reading the change in the room. His eyes dropped to the phone. His jaw set. "Who?" he said. Not a question. An instruction. Malachi showed him the screen. Xavier looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he took out his own phone and made a call. Short. 3 sentences. He ended it and moved to the door. "Don't," Malachi said. Xavier stopped. "They want you to come," Malachi said. His voice was steady. He didn't know how. "That's the point. They took him because they wanted you to move." Xavier turned back. "They think if you come out for this, if you react, it proves you're compromised." Malachi's throat was tight, but the words were clear. "They're not testing whether you'll fight. They're testing what I mean to you. That's the whole thing. That's all this is." Silence. Xavier looked at him in a way that was hard to hold. Direct. Unguarded in a way that felt almost wrong. Like seeing something that was supposed to be locked. "Then they already have their answer," he said quietly. He left the room. Malachi stood there for 4 seconds. Then he followed. The car moved fast and without headlights through the back end of a warehouse district Malachi didn't recognize. Xavier didn't explain the route. He sat in the front seat while a man Malachi hadn't seen before drove, and he watched out the window with the same deliberate stillness he brought to everything. Malachi sat in the back. He kept his hands flat on his thighs so they wouldn't shake visibly. He thought about the message. For words. No image. No location given directly, but Xavier had known where to go. Which meant whoever sent it had wanted Xavier to know. Had wanted him to come. To prove the point. That Xavier Doss would walk into a building alone for a person who wasn't family. Wasn't territory. Wasn't business. Just a man who'd been reading his documents for 3 weeks. The car stopped. A concrete building. Loading dock on the east side. 2 lights on inside, visible through high windows. Xavier stepped out and walked toward the east entrance without waiting. No army. He'd left them all behind. No second car following. No backup positioned on the roof. Just him. Malachi got out of the car. The driver reached back and caught his arm. "Stay here." Malachi looked at the building. One of those high windows had a shadow moving across it that didn't match the other shadows. He counted to 15. Then he followed. The interior was cold. Metal shelving along the walls. A single overhead light on a long cord that swayed slightly. 4 men stood near the center of the space. 2 more near the far wall. Quentin was in a chair. Wrists zip-tied. A bruise forming along his left cheekbone. Alert, frightened, but alert. His eyes found Malachi immediately. Then they found the man standing in the middle of the room. Xavier. Alone. The lead figure, wide-shouldered. A scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Spread his hands like he was presenting something. "Didn't think you'd actually come," he said. Amused. "No backup. No soldiers. Just you." He shook his head like a man whose point had been made for him. "That's all I needed to see." Xavier said nothing. He looked at Quentin, then at the 2 men near the far wall. His expression didn't change. The scarred man kept talking. "This is what happens when an alpha goes soft. You don't even know you're doing it. You just start showing up in rooms without a reason. Sitting next to people you shouldn't care about. Giving your enemies a map straight to your..." Xavier moved. Not fast in the showy way. Fast in the way that things fall. No announcement, just suddenly in motion and then done. The first man didn't see it coming. The second one had time to react. The third got his hands up. It didn't help. Malachi pressed his back to the shelving and watched a man he had spent 3 weeks convincing himself was quiet, restrained, limited. Take a room apart with the kind of precision that had no performance in it. No rage. No show. Just decisions made quickly, executed cleanly. Quentin's zip ties were cut 2 minutes later. Xavier crossed the room to Malachi. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. A cut above his right eyebrow was bleeding steadily, and he hadn't touched it. He looked at Malachi's face. "You followed," he said. Malachi didn't answer. Xavier made a low sound that wasn't quite a word. Then he stepped forward, and Malachi felt the arm that came around his back, pulling him in firmly. Not soft, not careful, just real. "Next time," Xavier said against his temple, "stay in the car." Malachi's hands came up and gripped the front of his shirt. And across the room, Quentin stared at both of them with an expression that had completely given up on making sense of this night. Xavier didn't let go right away. That was the thing. In Malachi's experience, in everything he understood about how men like Xavier moved through the world, the moment passed and the person moved on. The scene ended. Business resumed. Walls went back up and everyone went back to pretending they hadn't seen anything. Xavier stood there for another full minute with his arm around Malachi's back. Breathing. Not performing. Not processing. Just present. Malachi felt it. The full weight of it. The way it landed differently than comfort. More like decision. Like a man standing still in the middle of a space he'd chosen deliberately and refusing to move just because someone might be watching. Then Xavier stepped back. He looked at the cut above his eye in a glass panel on the far wall, dispassionately, the way you check whether something needs addressing. He pressed 2 fingers to it briefly, decided it did, didn't seem concerned. Malachi found his voice. "You left the team behind," he said. "Yes. That was deliberate." Xavier turned from the glass. "Everything I do is deliberate." Malachi stared at him. He thought about the folder, the internal memos. 9 months of choices stacked on top of each other. Restraint over force, quiet over noise, deliberate withdrawal from the kind of power that needed an audience to exist. He had watched Xavier in that room tonight. He had watched a man who chose when to move and how and at what speed, who didn't fill the space with theater, who walked through 6 armed men like it was administrative, and then crossed the room and put his arm around someone he should not, by any measure of his world, have allowed himself to care about. That matters. Xavier's power hadn't gone quiet because he'd lost it. It had gone quiet because he'd stopped needing to prove it. And that was a different thing entirely. Completely different thing. Quentin was on his feet, wrists free, rubbing circulation back into his hands. He looked at Malachi with the expression of a man who had about 40 questions and the wisdom to know now was not the time. They moved toward the exit in a loose group. The driver was outside. The car was running. Halfway down the loading dock steps, Xavier stopped. He hadn't telegraphed it. 1 second walking, the next stopped. His hand came to the railing. His head dropped slightly, just for a moment. Malachi was beside him before he'd consciously decided to move. "Xavier, I'm fine." He wasn't. The cut had bled more than it looked like. There was a second injury at his ribs. Malachi had seen him absorb it during the third man, the one who'd gotten his hands up. He'd seen Xavier take the hit clean and keep moving without breaking rhythm. He'd filed it away at the time without fully registering what it meant. It meant Xavier had taken real damage in that room, and hadn't made a sound. Malachi got a hand under his arm. Xavier didn't shake it off. They got to the car. Got Quentin in. Xavier in the back beside Malachi this time, not the front. The driver pulled out without needing direction. For a while, nobody spoke. Quentin fell asleep sitting up sometime before the 20-minute mark. His head tipped sideways against the window. His body had made a decision about stress that his brain hadn't gotten to yet. Malachi looked at Xavier in the low dark of the moving car. The bleeding had slowed. His eyes were open. His expression was the one he wore when he was somewhere inside his own thoughts. Not closed off, just internal. "You knew they were going to do something," Malachi said quietly. Xavier didn't deny it. "I knew something was building. And you didn't tell me." A beat. "No. Why?" Xavier turned and looked at him directly. In the dark and the movement of the car, the distance between them was smaller than either of them had set. "Because if I told you," he said, "you would have left." Malachi held his gaze. He couldn't argue with that. He would have. He knew exactly which night he would have packed his bag and gone and convinced himself it was the right call. The smart one, the clean one, the one that kept both of them from becoming this. From ending up in a cold warehouse in the middle of the night with one of them bleeding and the other one realizing too clearly and too late what the last 3 weeks had actually been. "You were choosing me," Malachi said, "not asking." "Over and over," Xavier said. "Every night." The car turned. Streetlights swept through the window in slow, even intervals, light, dark, light, dark, and Xavier hadn't looked away. Malachi felt it land in his chest and stay there. Not warmly, not cleanly, the way true things land, with full weight and no exit. He didn't pull away, but he didn't close the distance either. Not yet. Because outside this car, the scarred man on the floor of that warehouse had already sent a message before Xavier walked in. And someone had received it. And that someone hadn't shown up tonight, which meant they were still out there, waiting. 3 days later, Xavier called a meeting. Not in the study. Not in the private room with the candles and the documents and the chairs set close. In the main room. All of them. Malachi wasn't supposed to be there. He knew that. He stood in the connecting hallway, door cracked 2 inches, because Darius had looked at him on the way in with an expression that was equal parts warning and apology. And Malachi had decided those 2 things together meant. You should hear this. There were 9 men in the room. Xavier stood at the far end. No desk between him and the group. No chair. Just standing in a gray shirt. The cut above his eye reduced to a clean dark line. The way he always stood. Still and somehow larger than the room already was. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The Harlan faction moved because they believed I wouldn't respond, he said. They were wrong about the reason. I don't respond to fear. Haven't in a long time. But I do respond to threat. Silence. The man who tipped them off is in this room. The air changed. Everyone went still in that particular way that meant everyone was also watching everyone else. Malachi pressed closer to the door. Xavier's eyes moved around the room without hurry. No performance. No theater. He wasn't doing this for the reaction. He was doing it to end something. Fenwick, he said. One man near the left wall went rigid. Fenwick was older than the others. 40 maybe, gray at the temples. He'd been with Xavier's organization for 7 years. Malachi knew this from documents, from names that appeared repeatedly across months. He didn't speak. Xavier didn't raise his voice. You told them he was distracted, that he'd gone soft, that if they took someone close to him, he wouldn't move. A pause. You gave them the address, the timing, the access. Still nothing from Fenwick. You were testing whether I'd given up, Xavier said. Whether the version of me that's been choosing restraint for 9 months was all that was left. Fenwick's jaw worked once. Then, you have changed. Yes, Xavier said, like it was the simplest thing. That's the problem, Fenwick said. His voice was flat, certain. A man like you doesn't get to change. You change, the whole thing falls. Every alliance built on fear. Every territory held because of what you were. You think restraint is strength. It isn't. It's collapse happening slowly. Malachi held his breath. Xavier was quiet for a moment. One moment. Then he said, "You built your loyalty on what I could take from people. I'm not interested in that anymore." Fenwick shook his head. "Then you're not the same man." "No," Xavier said. "I'm not." What happened next was quiet. Two men moved to flank Fenwick. No violence. No scene. Just removal, clean and decided, the way Xavier did everything. Fenwick went without resistance. But at the door he stopped, turned, looked across the room, not at Xavier, at Malachi's door, like he'd always known. "Whatever he made you feel," Fenwick said, "is exactly what I was warning about." The door closed behind him. The room stayed silent. Then Xavier turned, and his eyes found the 2-inch gap in the connecting door, like he'd known exactly where it was the whole time. He crossed the room. He opened the door. Malachi was standing there with nowhere to go and nothing to say, and Xavier looked at him the way he'd looked at him in the back of the car 3 nights ago. Direct, unguarded, closer than the distance between them. "He wasn't entirely wrong," Malachi said. The words came out before he'd finished forming them. "What you feel, whatever this is, it did affect you. I did affect you. That's real." "I know," Xavier said. "That's not a small thing." "I know that too." Malachi looked at him. "Then what is this?" Xavier was quiet for a beat. Just one. "You're the only place I don't feel like I have to be what they made me." That landed hard. Clean and hard and without warning, the way the truest things do. Malachi felt it go through him like a current. The 3 weeks of sessions. The moved chairs. The forehead pressed quiet against his temple. The arm around his back in a cold warehouse while his brother sat in a chair with zip ties on his wrists. All of it. Every deliberate piece of it. "Say that again," Malachi said. And Xavier did. This time without the distance. For the first time since room 412, Malachi didn't pull away. The hospital room was too bright. Xavier had been moved there 48 hours after the warehouse. Not for the cut, not for the ribs, but for something the warehouse had made worse. Prior injury. The one from the ambush that had started all of this months ago, that had never fully closed the way it was supposed to. Malachi sat in a chair beside the bed. Not across from a desk. Not at a careful, deniable distance. Beside. Xavier's eyes were open. He was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man doing the kind of thinking that happens when the body slows down and the mind finally catches up. The room was quiet. Darius had come earlier. Left quickly. He'd looked at the chair Malachi was sitting in, and at Malachi in it, and something in his expression had settled. Not resolved, just settled. Like a question he'd been carrying for weeks had been answered quietly and filed away. Quentin had come too. He'd stood in the doorway for a moment, looked at his brother, looked at the man in the bed, looked back at his brother. "You're okay?" he'd asked Malachi. "Yeah," Malachi had said. Quentin had nodded once. The slow kind. The kind that meant, "I have thoughts. I will have them at you later. Not now." Then he'd left. Now it was just the two of them. The bright room. The low sound of the building outside the window. The faint smell of antiseptic that no amount of flowers on the windowsill could fully cover. Xavier turned his head and looked at Malachi. "You stayed," he said. "I'm here," Malachi said. A small difference. But Xavier heard it. because staying implied it had been a question. And Malachi wasn't framing it that way anymore. The silence between them was different now. Not heavy, not careful, not the kind that pressed and waited for something to break. Just present. Xavier reached out. His hand, the one without the four, came to rest on the arm of Malachi's chair. Not grabbing, not claiming, just close. Malachi looked at it. Then he moved his own hand and let it cover Xavier's. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The world outside the room was the same. The territories were the same. The alliances and the histories and the weight of what Xavier was, what he'd built, what he'd survived, none of that had been erased. Fenwick was gone, but Fenwick's question was still out there. There would be others who asked it, others who watched, others who tested the new shape of a man who had chosen to put down the performance of power. That was real. Malachi knew that. But so was this. The chair beside the bed instead of across the desk. The hand under his hand. The man in the bed who had walked into a warehouse alone, not to prove strength, not to reclaim anything, but because someone mattered to him, and he'd stopped pretending otherwise. Malachi thought about what Fenwick had said in the doorway. Whatever he made you feel is exactly what I was warning about. He thought about it, and he decided that Fenwick had been right about the feeling, wrong about everything else. Because the thing Xavier had found in those 3 weeks, in the moved chairs and the low candles and the deliberate proximity and the one quiet arm around Malachi's back in a cold room, wasn't weakness wearing the mask of tenderness. It was a man who had spent years being defined by what he could make other people feel: fear, submission, deference, and who had chosen, finally, to feel something himself. Not reclaim his manhood, redefine it. Malachi held onto his hand. Outside, the city moved on the way cities do, without knowing what had shifted inside one bright room on an ordinary floor in an ordinary building. Without caring, without marking it. But it had shifted, and both of them knew it, and neither of them pulled away. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. That's the full story. If it moved you, if it made you feel something, drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you hardest. Was it the warehouse? The confession in the hallway? Or that final quiet scene in the hospital room? This channel is for stories that challenge what strength actually looks like. Stories about men who choose not just react. If that's the kind of story you want more of, subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have a story of your own, about choosing differently, about redefining something people told you was fixed, leave it in the comments. Someone down there needs to read it.